Well, today we're going to talk about fair housing. When I talk about fair housing, what's some of the first things that come to mind? What are you hearing in the news today about fair housing? And how do you think people are being treated? Where do you see discrimination happening? Have you ever been impacted personally by discrimination? It's a lot to think about. We have an organization here in Cincinnati called HOME, Housing Opportunities Made Equal. It's a United Way organization, and their goal is to educate people about fair housing. HOME actually employs people to be testers. You can go out and they have people that are in wheelchairs that are testers that are handicapped, as well as black and white people that are in um, any kind of religion or nationality you can think of today. These people are actually going out and testing. They want to make sure that fair housing is being done properly across the board. When they test, they can test people such as real estate agents selling single family. They can test in multifamily. They can test in the commercial environment as well. The goal is to make sure that people are being treated fair and equal all the way through this whole real estate process. But home housing opportunities made equal would much rather come and educate you than they would investigate you. So know that there's this organization called Home Housing Opportunities Made Equal, and they're a resource here local, and they'll come and train your people how to be cognizant and aware of what is fair housing, what's required. So when we talk about fair housing, as real estate agents, we need to understand the law, and we need to be able to ultimately be equal and fair about how we approach people in this business. Our learning objectives for fair housing: explain the significance of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Yes, fair housing's been around. This whole issue has been around since 1866, but it has not been enforced. And the constitutional legal framework is to relate to and affect equal opportunity in housing. We're going to describe and explain the various federal laws which protect Americans from unfair housing practices. We'll talk about blockbusting, steering, redlining, and other abusive housing practices. We'll list the various recourses available to the aggrieved person who believes illegal discrimination has occurred, including acts against real estate professionals. We're going to describe the importance of real estate professionals understanding and complying with fair housing laws. So, again, equal opportunities housing. We've had Civil Rights Act of 1866 that prohibited discrimination based on race, but it really didn't do a lot. Yeah, you had the right to buy a house, but it didn't stop people from discriminating against people when they were trying to do this. The Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1868 is the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. It's hard to believe it's been around that long, but it really, like I said, has not been enforced that long. We really didn't see a lot of the Civil Rights Act and fair housing stuff enforced until probably the 60s and 70s and ultimately into the 80s. And then today, with all the things that have gone on in our political environment, we're starting to see more issues of fair housing and how it needs to be applied. There's also something called the Housing for Older Persons Act, HOPA, which is housing intended for those that are age 55 or older. At least 80% of occupied units have one person age 55 or older living in them. That's a requirement. And today what we're seeing is kind of the reverse of this. Older environments, older people living environments, senior housing projects, where the grandparents have now become the parents of their grandkids. And they brought their grandkids in to live with them, and now they're being asked to leave these senior housing environments because the people that live there don't want teenagers. They don't want young kids. The idea is it is senior housing, 55 or older. And as I approach this age, I keep thinking 55 isn't that old. But again, this would be all the people have to be 55 or older, the majority of them. So we're going to talk about definitions in fair housing. What is a dwelling? The dwelling is the apartment, is the house. And we want to look at how many bedrooms does it have, because ultimately the bedrooms can determine how many people can live in a unit. And those issues are not determined by you as the property owner necessarily. They're more determined about what's going on in the marketplace. Is it right to have, you have a mother and two teenage kids, one's a male, one's a female. Can they live in the room together? Are they allowed to live in the room together? Well, gosh, if we owned a house, whose business would it be? But when we rent housing, there is some business there, and we need to learn about the fair housing and how we can enforce the rules of habitability, and then also how you can mix the different sexes within a housing unit. Familial status, family. How many people can live in a unit? Many years ago, when I worked in an apartment community, the brand new units saved those for single people, and the family units lived in the older section of the apartment community. I did not realize that what we were doing back in the early 80s was violating fair housing, and we didn't honestly know it. But today, if somebody came to that unit, whether they were a family or whether they were just roommates, you have to show them all the different units, whatever's available. And then also disability. It's one of those things, what do you need to do for disabled people? How do you need to help them be able to transition and have accommodations that meet their needs? So disability is also now part of this. Exemptions to the Fair Housing Act. Owner-occupied buildings with no more than 4 units. So you own a 4-family. Do you have to prescribe to fair housing? Not really. Is it wise? Absolutely. But you don't have to if you're managing and running it on your own. You basically are exempted from fair housing. Single-family housing sold or rented without the use of a real estate professional. There's lots of FSBOs, for sale by owners. Those people do not have to abide by fair housing. Once you're a real estate agent, you absolutely have to abide by it. You don't want to take a listing from somebody that's not going to abide by fair housing, that's not going to give you that opportunity. If you find they do, you're better off to walk away from a listing, or advise them that no matter what they say, you're bound as a realtor to be bound by fair housing laws, and you will not discriminate and can't discriminate, and you may be bringing people to them that they may not wish to sell to. Ultimately, it's not going to be a great relationship. You're probably better off getting out of that listing. Housing that's operated by organizations and private clubs that limit occupancy to members. There's some ways they're around the fair housing and their exemptions. For instance, if it's a Catholic-owned property and they're renting to males only, and they can do some of that again, but it has to be certain as to how the building is organized and what's going on. And again, that's males only. It doesn't tell us about what their race or their religion is or their creed. So again, watch what that is. The rental of rooms or units in an owner-occupied building of no more than 4 units. You want to rent out part of your house? You can discriminate all you want. More than anything, it's not really discrimination, though. It's, will you get along with that person? Do you trust that person? There's more things to look at than this whole issue of discrimination. The sale or rental of single-family home when the home is owned by an individual who does not own more than 3 such homes at one time, and it does not sell more than one every 2 years. They're not required to follow fair housing laws. A real estate professional is not involved in the transaction. Somebody, again, selling on their own or buying on their own, doesn't apply. Discriminatory advertising is not used, those kind of things. Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. This requires reasonable accommodations in employment and access to goods, services, and public buildings. So we want to talk about what is reasonable accommodations. When you have an apartment building and you're making modifications on it, let's say you own a 12-family and you're going to do modifications on it and you're going to go file for a permit. The building department is going to make you do some things and spend some of that money on accommodations, on ADA requirements. Whenever you go get a permit and you're doing something that's multi-family commercial thought, then the building department will enforce some of the ADA kind of guidelines and make you do those things when you're doing improvements. But the other thing you have to remember is if you own a building and you don't have money, you're not going to do improvements, what do you have to do for the person that comes to your door that needs help? Well, you let them make their own improvements. And they can do it with your contractors or they can do it with their contractors. Make sure they have lien waivers, that they're not going to let anything bad happen to the property. You can oversee how they're going to do modifications. but you let them make the accommodations that they need, and then they can return to some condition when they're done. So that's basically reasonable accommodations. That's Title I. Title III, full accessibility to businesses, goods, and public services. The idea is to give them the ability to get around, to travel around, to be able to get the things that they need. And so when you think about it, it is a practical thing, and it's also the right way to go about doing your business is to provide accessibility for people that need help. ADA exempts. Property is covered by Fair Housing Act, which already prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So it's already been chosen or pinpointed as going to be helping disabled people. Property is exempt from coverage by Fair Housing Act, such as housing for those that are 55 years and older. Obviously, if it's a 55 years and older facility, it's already going to have modifications to it to let older people survive and do what they need to do on a daily basis. So it will meet some of the ADA requirements already. Fair housing practices. The fair housing practices that we learned about are blockbusting, steering, advertising, appraising, redlining, intent and effect of fair housing and fair housing practices, and the response and concerns of terrorism. Okay, so we got all these terrorism acts going on. You know, who do we say can and can't live in our communities? Who are we to judge who they are? How do we know who they are? Criminal and background checks work fine, and that should be the extent of it. You shouldn't be going into the religion and how, you know, how they look and how they dress and what they do. So response and concerns of terrorism has heightened some of the things that we have going on today. Other things that real estate agents do, and not on purpose, they do this out of the goodness of their heart, they tend to steer people. Let's say we have an Indian couple that comes into town and they want to look at a house, and we know that there's an Indian neighborhood, and we want to take the Indian couple to that neighborhood. That's not our job. Our job is to take them to everything available. It's not our job to push them and only show them that neighborhood. As a realtor, we hope and we think that people will survive better, live with people that they're familiar with, that they do things together with, and that they are you have similar likes and activities, but it's not our choice. So we shouldn't be steering people. Anybody that comes to you and wants to look at a piece of real estate, your goal is, well, what can they afford? How big should it be? What school district do they want to be in? It's anything but the steering piece of the business. Enforcement of Fair Housing Act. We, as realtors, if there's complaints against us, it can be investigated by HUD. Typically, though, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, or one of those organizations will be called to send testers in, and then they'll submit their findings to HUD. Penalties for violations. It can be $16,000 for the first offense, $37,500 for the second violation within 5 years, and $65,000 for a further violation within 7 years. As a realtor, as a salesperson, you can get charged with this, but then also if you have a broker that overseeing what you're doing, they can also be charged with these penalties. There's state and local enforcement agencies. All real estate agents should be aware of their state's fair housing laws, as well as applicable laws and local ordinances. Ohio actually has more than 7 classes. We have 11 classes of protected fair housing, and over time you'll read and learn more about all of those. Threats or acts of violence. The Fair Housing Act protects the rights of those who seek benefits of fair housing laws. Threats, coercion, and intimidation are punishable by criminal action, so we can't be a part of that either. And if we know what's going on, there's such a thing as being complicit by being silent. So we have to report and educate those that we know they're doing things wrong. Implications for real estate professionals. There are consequences. There are monetary penalties. There can be threat to a livelihood or career, and we can have license suspension or revocation if you're found guilty of doing this stuff. And that's it for fair housing.